After her grandfather sold the house, Linda, her dad, and her older sister Marianne moved into a small apartment. Impatient to join the adult world, Linda took a job as a clerk typist for a Wall Street brokerage firm, earning $40 a week. The pay, obviously, wasn't great, but that was all right. The job was merely a vehicle for Linda, who had been assured by her sister, Marianne, that there was no shortage of eligible bachelors, good stock, so to speak, on Wall Street. And, in fact, it wasn't long before the money men were lining up for a chance to compete for Linda's affections. She briefly dated a very nice and very wealthy stockbroker whose apartment overlooking Central Park had a foyer larger than Linda's home. He treated Linda well, took her to nice restaurants, spoiled her with expensive gifts. But she found him physically unattractive, and their relationship was never consummated. Later, she dated one of the firm's partners. He was even wealthier and just as cordial and respectful, and Linda got the sense that he might even be falling in love with her and perhaps one day propose marriage. Again, however, there was no spark for Linda, no passion, and soon she put an end to their relationship. So despite where she worked and despite the affections of wealthy suitors, Linda remained a poor girl from Brooklyn. Most of her meager salary was passed on to her father. Lacking the resources to buy new outfits, she borrowed dresses from Marianne or from her friend Annie, whose father owned a Bensonhurst pool room. A lot of wise guys hung out at the pool room. Sometimes they visited Annie's father at his house. It was during one of these visits that Linda met Larry Pistone, a married big shot in the Gambino family. Larry had a well-deserved reputation for being tough and vicious. Violent confrontations were his forte, and he never shied away from conducting business regardless of the audience. On more than one occasion, he beat down men who were delinquent on their payments in full view of their spouses and children. A curious thing about mobsters, though, they often keep the darker side of their personalities and their work hidden from those they love. Pistone was unfailingly polite and gracious to Linda. Among the fronts for his illicit enterprises was a butcher shop, and Pistone frequently brought the finest cuts of the day for Linda and her family, filet mignon and sirloin, the choicest meats, the ones her father could never afford. Larry also kept a boat docked at Sheepshead Bay. On weekends and evenings, he and Linda would go there to escape the withering summer heat and humidity. Thanks to Larry's influence and wealth, Linda became a fixture at trendy Manhattan restaurants and nightclubs such as the Copacabana and the Peppermint Lounge. Some stealth was required for a teenager to live this sort of exotic life, but Linda was nothing if not resourceful. Usually nothing more was required than a simple lie to her father. "I'm staying at Annie's house tonight, okay?" Dad was often too tired and loved his daughter too much to argue or investigate. Linda was 17 going on 30, and she found herself enormously attracted to Larry and the lifestyle he provided. Moreover, she found him physically attractive, and before long, the two of them were involved in a romantic relationship. That Linda was still not yet a legal adult was of no concern to either one of them. If, on some level, Linda was falling in love with Larry Pistone, she remained a free spirit nonetheless. On opening night at the Flamingo Lounge, Linda was in the crowd enjoying a night out with her friend Annie. The atmosphere was exciting, intoxicating. Go-go girls danced on a small stage. Music and cigarette smoke filled the hall. Well-dressed men threw money around with reckless abandon. Seated at the bar were two men Linda recognized. They were regulars at the pool hall where she and Annie hung out. They were also friends of Linda's father. The girls knew the men only by their nicknames, Sonny Squint and Linguini. As Linguini was doing his best to flirt with Linda, Greg Scarpa Sr. walked into the club. Linda spotted him instantly. He was tall and handsome, with thick hair and olive skin. Linda was transfixed. She stared at Scarpa until she caught his eye. Finally, while shaking hands and moving elegantly, smoothly through the crowd, Scarpa spotted Linda. He gave her a big smile and immediately began walking in her direction. Sonny Squint, who ran numbers for Scarpa, quickly introduced Greg Sr. to the two young women. Greg Sr. bought them each a drink. "So what do you do?" he asked Linda. "Oh, I work on Wall Street," she said, trying to instill an unmerited measure of importance into her $40-a-week job. Scarpa, of course, knew better, but didn't let on. He merely listened and nodded attentively as Linda raved about the excitement of Wall Street and complained about the long, sweaty daily commute from her home in Brooklyn. Scarpa smiled. "If you were with me, I'd air-condition your subway car." Linda laughed like a nervous schoolgirl. Although he was old enough to be her father, she found Scarpa extremely attractive, and clearly the feeling was mutual. "You have eyes like black olives," Scarpa said at one point. "So dark and beautiful." "Oh, I never heard that line before," Linda replied, laughing. The truth was, she hadn't, at least not from anyone whose opinion mattered. As Sinatra sang on the jukebox, Linda asked Greg Sr. to dance. The mobster was unaccustomed to such initiative on the part of a woman, especially one so young, but he didn't mind in the least. With a disarming smile, he took Linda's hand in his and led her onto the dance floor. They danced slowly, gently, romantically, with Scarpa singing along softly. Linda felt herself moving her body closer to his as they swayed gently to the music, content to be in his arms. Scarpa drove Linda home at the end of the evening and asked for her telephone number. "No, you give me yours," Linda countered. If this seemed like merely a bit of the mating dance, acting coy on the first date, it was actually something else entirely. Linda figured, quite reasonably, that Larry Pistone probably wouldn't like the idea of Linda dancing with Greg Scarpa Sr. at the Flamingo. Certainly he'd be unhappy to hear that she had given Scarpa her phone number, an act of implied intimacy. Scarpa seemed disappointed by Linda's reluctance, but acquiesced anyway. He withdrew a pack of matches from his jacket and wrote down his phone number. Then he gave it to Linda. She looked at the number and smiled. "I'll call you," she said. "Promise." True to her word, Linda contacted Greg Sr. a few days later, and the two of them arranged to have dinner at Romano's, an old-world Italian restaurant not far from Scarpa's club. Not normally one to drop his guard quite so quickly, Greg Sr. found himself so captivated by Linda that he began sharing his deepest desires. She had been haunting his dreams, he explained. When he closed his eyes at night, he saw her face staring down at him. Linda reached across the table and touched his hand. In that moment, he seemed almost vulnerable. After dinner, they went to the Flamingo, where Scarpa introduced her to several members of his crew. Including the Saponaro brothers, John and Joseph, they were known, of course, as Johnny Sapp and Joey Sapp, Nicky Bianco, Bobby Zombardi, and Fat Jojo. The men all admired Linda's radiant beauty, and Greg Sr. beamed proudly in her presence. The guys in the crew, killers and burglars and drug dealers, could see that their boss had fallen hard for the new girl, and they didn't blame him one bit. In the early morning hours, when Linda arrived at home, she was surprised to find her father awake, sitting at the kitchen table. He'd been waiting up for her. "What's wrong, Daddy?" Linda asked, trying to sound as though she hadn't done anything wrong. Her father waited a long time before responding. Then he told Linda about a recent conversation he'd had with Sonny Squint. Something about Linda dating a gangster, a married gangster no less, named Greg. Linda shook her head. Then she embraced her father. Sonny Squint, she said, was a damn liar. Yeah, she'd met a nice, older man, but he wasn't married and he wasn't a mobster. His name was George, and he was as sweet and good-natured as a puppy dog. And that was all Linda's father needed to hear. Whether he believed her or not was irrelevant. He wanted to believe, and that was enough. From that day on, Greg Scarpa Sr. became George to Linda's family. Lavish, overflowing baskets of fruit and bouquets of flowers would arrive at the house. Invariably, they would be accompanied by a thoughtful card signed by a man named George. Linda's father accepted the gifts at face value, never trafficked in skepticism. "You really hit the jackpot," he'd say to Linda. "That George sure is a great guy." But he wasn't the only guy. Linda secretly and separately maintained relationships with both Larry Pistone and Greg Sr. Oddly enough, she continued to have sex with Pistone, but wouldn't allow Greg Sr. to make love to her. Why? The longing, the anticipation made them both feel like kids. Greg Sr. and Linda took long walks in the park, held hands, and shared previously untold secrets. Although they made out in his car, Scarpa never pushed Linda into having sex. Although impulsive by nature and impatient in most other aspects of his life, he was willing to wait for Linda. One night he said, "You know, sweetheart, when you're ready to make love to me, just tell me you want to get drunk." Linda laughed. "You got it." There was something exciting about balancing two relationships, keeping two men happy while never letting on that the other existed. For a while, Linda pulled it off without a hitch, until one Friday night, while leaving the Copacabana with Larry Pistone, the couple was confronted by Pistone's wife. Most wise guys' wives knew what was going on behind their backs. As long as the mafioso was discreet and didn't do something stupid, like fall in love with his Gumar or, God forbid, run off with her, no one seemed to mind too much. But Mrs. Pistone was a philandering husband's nightmare. Rather than turn a blind eye to Larry's affairs, she followed him to the Copa, then waited outside for him to emerge with his girlfriend. There, with Pistone's mob buddies and their Gumars, looking on in horror, Mrs. Pistone threw a temper tantrum in front of Larry's Brooklyn mob cronies and their girlfriends. Linda stayed just long enough to hear Pistone's wife call her a whore. Humiliated by the spectacle, she flagged down a cab and went straight to the Flamingo Lounge. She rushed inside, found Greg Sr., and began unburdening herself of her secrets. She told Scarpa all about her relationship with Larry Pistone. She told him what had happened at the Copacabana. To her relief, Scarpa seemed remarkably understanding. In fact, he seemed moved by her confession. It was almost as if it had brought them closer. Later that night, as Scarpa drove Linda home, they ran into Larry Pistone. He had been searching for Linda, and now that he had found her, he wasn't about to let her run off. Pistone knew of Scarpa's reputation, of course, but he didn't care. Emboldened by alcohol, furious at having been embarrassed by his wife, he projected an almost suicidal air of defiance. "Get out of the car," he instructed Linda. Scarpa leaned forward and reached beneath the seat of his car, where he always kept a baseball bat. Linda, sensing something horrible about to happen, and feeling responsible for it as well, suddenly began to weep. She begged Scarpa to remain calm, to ignore Pistone's rage. Just about any other time, Scarpa would have beaten Pistone bloody. But with Linda by his side, imploring him, begging him, he softened. With one hand on the bat and another on the steering wheel, he cursed at Pistone, who finally, and fortunately, drove away. As the tail lights of Pistone's car faded in the distance, Greg Sr. pulled Linda close and brushed away her tears. "Be my girl," he said. "I'll take care of you." Linda nodded, tucked her body into the crook of Scarpa's arm. For the first time in memory, maybe for the first time in her life, she felt safe. Chapter 7. Scarpa's Mistress. When it came to keeping his Gumar at a safe and manageable distance, Greg Scarpa proved to be an utter failure. In reality, Linda was the great love of Scarpa's life, and their relationship can be viewed as proof that even mobsters and killers are subject to human frailties and emotions. Their bond was cemented one evening as they sat together at the Flamingo Lounge. When Linda stared at Greg Sr., holding court as usual, she felt an overwhelming surge of desire and passion. So, Linda smiled at Greg, put her arms around his neck, and whispered in his ear, "Let's get drunk." He smiled back, nodded, and kissed her gently. A few hours later, they checked into the Lincoln Hotel on Staten Island. At once nervous and excited, like teenagers on their first date, they toasted each other with champagne, smoked a little weed to ease the tension, and began to make love. Greg Sr. tried to take his time, but when he started to penetrate Linda, he came too quickly. For a man who prided himself on control and patience, this was a disturbing and embarrassing development, and Scarpa did not hide his disappointment. "After all this time," he said, "I can't believe that happened." Linda merely smiled and pulled him close. "Don't worry," she said. "We have the rest of our lives." The tender intimacy of this moment was short-lived, as Linda suddenly realized something was wrong. Even in a dimly lit hotel room, she could see the blood, and the sight caused her heart to race. Frightened, she ran into the bathroom to get some towels, but the menstrual flow was so heavy now that she began to feel lightheaded. "What's wrong, baby?" Scarpa asked when she emerged from the bathroom. "Take me home," Linda answered. "Please." Linda spent the night in the bathroom of her apartment, trying unsuccessfully to staunch the flow of blood. The next morning, after wobbling into her bedroom and passing out, she was discovered by her father, who picked her up, put her in the car, and drove her to the hospital. There, of course, Linda received the news that she had both feared and anticipated. The bleeding had been caused by a miscarriage. As it turned out, Linda had been nearly 3 months into a pregnancy, the result of her relationship with Pistone. When she awoke from the dilation and curettage medical procedure, the first person Linda saw was Scarpa. He stood at the side of her bed, tears welling in his eyes. "I understand what happened," he told her, "and I don't want you to worry about anything. I'll take care of you." By this time, Scarpa had already paid the hospital bill. Rather than return to her apartment, Linda recuperated at the home of her sister, Marianne, who had recently married, and her brother-in-law, Morris. Greg Sr. called often and sent flowers nearly every day. Eventually, Linda felt well enough to agree to a lunch date. When Scarpa pulled up outside in a late-model Cadillac, Marianne was practically speechless. She watched as Scarpa slowly emerged from the car and snuffed out a cigarette. He was attired elegantly, his skin bronzed, and the brim of his fedora adjusted perfectly. "Oh, God," Marianne said, putting a hand to her mouth and trying to stifle a laugh. "He looks like a gangster." Linda smiled and nodded. "He is. And by the way, his name is Greg." Scarpa's visits became more frequent. He'd bring her flowers, jewelry, sometimes even malted milkshakes. "I'm trying to fatten her up," Scarpa joked, to help Linda regain her strength. One evening, while dropping Linda off at her sister's house, they saw Larry Pistone's car parked in front. Pistone wasted little time in confronting his wayward girlfriend. "I thought I told you to stay away from Scarpa," he shouted. This was not the type of thing one did in front of a man like Greg Scarpa Sr., unless, of course, one possessed a secret death wish. But Scarpa barely had time to react since Linda immediately jumped to her own defense. "Shut up, Larry," she yelled. "It's all over between us. Leave me alone. I'm with Greg now." If only things were decided so easily and swiftly and bloodlessly in the Mafia. Two made men from competing crime families embroiled in a dispute over a beautiful young woman. Was there a more volatile situation? Or one that was worse for business? Linda might have been laboring under the impression that she was free to choose her paramours. To mob elders, however, the young woman's feelings and concerns were among the very least important factors. They cared about one thing: money. If the machinery of mob business was threatened by the jealousies of two high-ranking mafiosos, then no one stood to gain. A peaceful, reasoned solution was required. To that end, Scarpa and Pistone were summoned to a meeting, a sit-down, with the heads of the Gambino and Colombo families to settle their beef over Linda. Hostilities provoked by territoriality regarding women was nothing new to the mob. Indeed, throughout history, men have fought battles large and small over the affections of beautiful women. The Mafia, however, had long prided itself on encouraging rational thinking when passion raised its ugly head. This, however, was a particularly delicate situation. The first time that two senior members of major gangs had threatened to come to blows over a teenager. In every way, it was an ugly, dangerous situation, and one that required careful disposition. In the end, it was neither strength nor seniority that won the day for Greg Scarpa, but rather an ability to convince family leaders that his love for Linda was genuine. The Mafia bosses officially ruled that only Scarpa would be permitted to date Linda, a decision that thrilled both of them. To celebrate their victory, Greg Sr. bought Linda a new Buick Riviera and encouraged her to quit her job so that he could take care of her. She did. She also moved back in with her father. On her 18th birthday, Greg Sr. gave her a beautiful gold bracelet inscribed with the words, "I love you forever, G," and then took her to the Copacabana. He invited a group of friends to share the celebration. A dozen of Greg Sr.'s pals, including Joe Colombo, the titular head of the crime family, joined them at a table filled with flowers and champagne as they listened to singer Tom Jones. Linda was now officially Scarpa's girlfriend, and his friends acknowledged their relationship by presenting her with gifts, envelopes stuffed with cash for the most part. Less sanguine about Scarpa's victory was Linda's father. Upon learning that his daughter's new beau was not merely a handsome older gentleman named George, but rather the notorious Mafia gangster Greg Scarpa Sr., Linda's dad was outraged. A man of limited means who wasted a large portion of his meager salary betting on the ponies, Linda's father was at once envious of Scarpa and frightened of him. Mainly, he feared for Linda's safety. Again, though, Scarpa proved remarkably adept at winning the affections of someone who at first seemed skeptical. He shared a few drinks with Linda's dad, bought a few things for their home, gave him some tips on picking winners at the track, and generally ingratiated himself in a way that surprised even Linda's father. How bad could he be, this smiling, charming Pied Piper of a gangster? Soon enough, Scarpa became a fixture at Linda's home, so comfortable in his surroundings and so sure of the family's allegiance that on one occasion he would use her apartment as a temporary warehouse for stolen goods. Linda's father arrived home from work one evening and discovered that he couldn't gain access to his own living room. The door had been wedged shut. With some effort, he pried it open, just a crack, and then peered into the room where, to his shock and dismay, he discovered dozens of large boxes. At the center of the great pile of swag was Linda, smiling beatifically.
"What in the hell is this?"
her father yelled.
"Calm down, Daddy," Linda responded. "They're color TVs."
Linda ran a hand along the top of one of the boxes, then smiled at her father.
"Greg says you should pick one out for yourself."
And that was that. Like most everyone else who stood in Greg Scarpa's way, Linda's father had become an obstacle cleared. Sometimes, Scarpa knew, charm worked as well as muscle. Scarpa would stop by late at night, and they would lie in her bed together and make love. Linda was young, beautiful, and passionate, as unbridled and desirable as any woman he'd known. Certainly she stood in marked contrast to Scarpa's wife, Connie. Scarpa had once taken Connie to a hotel in an attempt to break the routine of their love life. She reacted with dismay.
"Why in the world would you want to waste money on a hotel room when we have a perfectly good bed at home?"
And so he turned to Linda, who was not only young and beautiful, but appreciative of such gestures. That the lifestyle he provided was funded by crime and violence was a trivial detail, one that excited her. Once, Greg Sr. and his crew had broken into a bank vault and came to Linda's apartment late at night, dumping 3 large canvas sacks of cash and jewels onto the dining room table, and admiring and evaluating everything before turning it over to be fenced. As Greg Sr. sorted through the gems, remarking on the continued good fortune of his hard-working crew, he held a man's ring up to the light. It was large and encrusted with diamonds, almost ostentatious in its girth. Suddenly, he paused and frowned.
"Damn it,"
Scarpa snarled.
"We can't keep this one."
"Why not?"
Linda asked.
"Because it belongs to Whitey Ford."
Indeed, this was no ordinary bauble, but a World Series ring engraved with the name of the great New York Yankees left-handed pitcher. This was 1964, when the Yankees owned New York, and Ford was among the finest players in baseball. He was, in fact, Scarpa's favorite ballplayer.
"We have to send it back,"
Scarpa said, tucking the ring into his pocket, illustrating once again that mobsters live by their own particular, peculiar code of conduct. It should be noted, however, that Whitey Ford says he never recovered the original stolen ring. Instead, a new one was later provided by Yankees owner George Steinbrenner. Another evening, when Linda was home alone waiting for Scarpa to arrive, detectives broke through the front door.
"Where is he?"
they shouted.
"We know he's here."
When Greg Sr. walked in and saw the detectives, he laughed and asked,
"What the hell is going on?"
"We've got you now," said one of the detectives. Scarpa didn't even blink. While other detectives ransacked the apartment, apparently in a haphazard search for evidence of some random criminal misdeeds, Scarpa calmly opened a desk drawer and withdrew a small, black, leather-bound notebook. With a smile, he reached out and opened the jacket of one of the detectives and then slid the notebook into the cop's breast pocket.
"See me tomorrow,"
Scarpa said with a wink. The following day, the cop and the gangster met for lunch. Scarpa traded a stack of money for the notebook, the pages of which included detailed information about his numbers racket. The amazed detective thanked Scarpa and added, "If you ever decide to teach a class, let me know. I want to be the first one there." Everything Scarpa did for Linda, and the laundry list of favors included showering her with gifts, stolen and legitimate, fixing a beauty contest in which she was a contestant, arranging a fashion modeling and cosmetic contract, had the rather obvious and predictable and perfectly human effect of making Linda feel special. It was impossible to be in Greg Scarpa's orbit and not be subject to the effects of gravity. One evening at the Flamingo, Linda and Greg Sr. were standing together at the bar when one of the club's scantily clad dancers sidled up to him and began flirting, casually and expertly brushing Scarpa's arm with her breasts. "I want her fired," Linda said, after the dancer had departed. Scarpa smiled and raised a hand, as if to say, "Consider it done." The dancer was gone by morning. She never worked at the Flamingo again. Males who displeased Linda were dealt with more harshly, regardless of whether their transgressions were intentional or deliberate, perceived or real. There was the time, for example, that an unfortunate Flamingo bartender named George let the pressure of a busy night cloud his judgment, and he made the mistake of speaking curtly to Linda. When Scarpa found out, he summoned George to the men's room, where he proceeded, in grand schoolyard fashion, to immerse the poor bartender's head in the toilet. He, too, never worked another day at the Flamingo. Although tradition dictated that women were to be kept largely ignorant of Mafia activities, regardless of their relationship to a made man, Linda found herself exempt from the usual operating procedures. Almost from the moment she met Scarpa, Linda was privy to information most Mafia girlfriends, or wives for that matter, never knew, or wanted to know. In many ways, Scarpa regarded her less as a trophy than a partner. "We can talk about anything in front of Linda," Scarpa once proudly proclaimed to his attorney, Lou Diamond. "I don't keep secrets from her." Over time, Scarpa began to reveal not just the more glamorous aspects of his work, if stealing and hijacking can be considered glamorous, but the grislier aspects as well. One night, following a heist, Scarpa showed up at Linda's apartment with two guys from his crew. Greg Sr. was in a buoyant mood. As he tossed a thick steak into a cast-iron pan and cranked up the heat, Scarpa began to laugh. "You should have seen the look on this guy's face when I pulled out the gun," he said to Linda. A short time later, as the crew sat down to eat, Scarpa shared the gory details of the heist, which apparently included blowing off the head of one of the victims. Scarpa's gleeful depiction of the incident so resonated with the crew that one poor guy dashed off to the bathroom to vomit. This, too, Scarpa found rather amusing. Weren't mobsters supposed to have strong stomachs? For her part, Linda was neither repulsed nor amused. She simply accepted Scarpa for what and who he was. In her eyes, the good outweighed the bad, even if she knew, on some level, that the bad was particularly heinous. Having become rather savvy about the ways of the Mafia, Linda understood killing to be part of the contract, implicit or stated, when one became involved with a made man. If Greg had to kill someone, Linda figured he must have good reason for doing it. At least that is the rationalization she chose to embrace. And anyway, it wasn't like this was the first time she'd been regaled with tales of murder and mayhem, although it was a bit more graphic than usual. Not long after they first met, Scarpa had revealed to Linda that he had personally murdered at least 20 people. He hadn't bragged about it, hadn't attempted to explain or otherwise mitigate the circumstances surrounding their deaths. He just tossed it out there, another little tidbit of information to help her fill in the gaps as their relationship blossomed. Maybe it was a test to see how she'd respond. If so, Linda passed. In Scarpa's world, killing was a route to respect as well as riches. That respect rubbed off on Linda, and she liked the way it felt. Chapter 8. Mississippi Burning. When it came to Linda, Scarpa's trust was complete. There was no detail of his life, professional or otherwise, that he was unwilling to share. She was his friend, lover, confessor. Only a few months after they began dating, Scarpa took Linda to Romano's. Over dinner, he held her hand and told her the deepest of secrets, a secret that would cost him his life if she repeated it. "I have this other thing that I do," he said. "I help the government, the FBI and the CIA. Sometimes they need special help, and that's where I come in." Scarpa paused to let the information sink in. This revelation, of course, was an affront to the unwritten Mafia code of conduct. But there was more to it, Linda knew, and she waited for his full explanation. "Please don't think I'm a rat," he continued. "I do work for them. After all, I really love my country." Whether this was true or not, Linda could never say for sure, nor did she particularly care. Perhaps Scarpa did see himself as some sort of noble hero, a double agent serving his country. Or, more likely, that is the fantasy he concocted to gain acceptance from those he loved, and to find a measure of peace in his life. His was a self-aggrandizing, amoral existence, and it required a bit of myth-making. To that end, Scarpa told Linda that he often accepted the federal government's dirtiest and most dangerous jobs, assignments even the FBI and CIA found too distasteful or risky to undertake on their own. Among Scarpa's missions, helping the government frame members of Israel's Mossad, setting up a sting operation for the CIA, and gathering intelligence on Howard Hughes and his connection to the Mafia. Scarpa spun these tales with great gusto, twisting his role as an informant into something else entirely. And once rolling, he found himself unable to stop. Omerta, apparently, was a concept that did not apply to Scarpa. To bolster his case, or perhaps simply to feed his own version of the fantasy, Scarpa even introduced Linda to Tony Villano. Linda became fond of Villano. The two men often used her apartment as a place to conduct business, and sometimes Villano would arrive early and drink coffee with Linda until Scarpa arrived. In those days, Greg Sr. wore numerous hats, often contradictory in nature. For example, he served as a public spokesman for the Italian-American Civil Rights League, generally regarded as a daring role for a Mafia member. The League, set up by Mafia Don Joe Colombo, was a none too subtle attempt by the mob to legitimize itself, while simultaneously earning enormous income from the League's membership, which included hundreds of thousands of dues-paying Italian-Americans who objected to being stereotyped as gangsters because of their Italian descent. The League was an overwhelming financial and public relations success, its legitimacy stamped by the endorsement of politicians who routinely spoke at League rallies. Greg Scarpa Sr. was a potent and charismatic fixture at these events. A natural politician and leader, he would incite and inflame the constituency with all manner of theatrical antics. Climbing aboard a flatbed truck or grabbing a microphone and delivering an impromptu, rousing speech attacking the federal government's bias. He also spoke at the League's weekly protest rallies outside the FBI's New York offices on East 69th Street. Television coverage of these events often included clips of Greg Sr. wearing his signature dark glasses, denouncing the anti-Italian investigators. If Linda was impressed by Scarpa's confidence and courage, she also couldn't help noticing that he sometimes seemed almost reckless. In retrospect, of course, Scarpa's behavior can be seen as narcissistic, if not downright delusional, but at the time, it was more exciting than anything else. After one particularly heated rally, he took Linda to a Chinese restaurant where he spotted Tony Villano sitting at a table. Greg Sr. brazenly greeted his friend. "Hey, Paisan, you like that speech?" He and Linda joined Villano for dinner, and Linda spent most of the evening anxiously scanning the restaurant's entrance. Of the several hundred people that had attended that afternoon's rally, many were from Bensonhurst and knew Greg Sr. personally. They had just watched him deliver an angry speech against the FBI and the government. What if some of those same people saw him now sharing dinner with Villano? What if they walked into the restaurant and saw Greg Scarpa Sr. laughing and chatting amiably with a federal law enforcement officer? The thought so frightened Linda that she could scarcely touch her food, a fact that did not escape Scarpa's attention. He reached over and put a hand on Linda's shoulder. "Don't worry," he said. "It's okay." Scarpa then proceeded to tell Villano all about the rally, the names of gangsters who had been in attendance, how they hoped to exploit League contacts, and about Joe Colombo's upcoming plans. Important, deeply privileged information, the sharing of which was surely an egregious violation of Mafia protocol. Linda could only marvel at Scarpa's bravado. And this was only the beginning. One day, Scarpa excitedly told Linda that he had a new assignment from the FBI, one related to a case that had garnered national attention. His job, Scarpa explained, was to find the bodies of 3 civil rights workers believed to have been murdered in the summer of 1964 in Meridian, Mississippi, by the Ku Klux Klan. Michael Schwerner, a white graduate of Cornell University, had gone to Mississippi with his wife, Rita, to work for the Congress of Racial Equality. After opening a community center in Meridian, Mississippi, the young couple had undertaken a variety of altruistic causes, including teaching young African American children to read and write and encouraging their parents to register and vote. James Cheney, 21, who was black, was a frequent visitor at the center and had become Schwerner's friend and confidant. In June, Schwerner and Cheney had driven to Oxford, Ohio, to help train volunteers for a Mississippi voter registration drive known as Freedom Summer. There they befriended Andrew Goodman, a 20-year-old white New York college student. After reaching Mississippi on June 20th, the 3 men had spent a day inspecting the ruins of a black church near Philadelphia, Mississippi, that had been firebombed by the Ku Klux Klan. Local police acknowledged that they had pulled over a Ford station wagon carrying the 3 young men. Their explanation? The vehicle had been traveling at an excessive rate of speed. Authorities later said the men were then detained at a local lockup because of suspicions that they had been involved in the church burning. According to police, the 3 were held until nightfall and then released unharmed. But the men were never again seen alive. Mississippi politicians, including United States Senator James Eastland, had said that their disappearance was probably just a publicity stunt staged by the 3 civil rights workers to call attention to their cause. It was widely believed that Ku Klux Klan members had murdered the 3 young men. Their bodies, however, had not turned up, despite the largest FBI manhunt in history. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, under tremendous pressure from Attorney General Robert Kennedy and President Lyndon Johnson, had authorized the full weight and force of his agency in service of this investigation to find the bodies and solve the case. And yet, it had proved fruitless. And now, Greg Scarpa, like some sort of superhero, supposedly had been summoned to solve the mystery. Scarpa wanted Linda to join him on this mission, and the invitation both shocked and excited her. Linda had never, ever even flown on an airplane, so this would be a real adventure. Greg Sr. laid out the itinerary. They would first visit the Gulf Coast near Mississippi, where Greg would conduct his investigation. Then they would fly to Miami to visit Linda's uncle. Linda, naturally, was more excited about the trip than the mission. To her, this was just another fringe benefit of being Greg Scarpa's mistress. Their life together was becoming increasingly surreal. They flew first class, Linda wearing an expensive new print dress and matching hat that Greg had purchased for her prior to the trip. Not even a bumpy flight and a bout of air sickness could spoil the trip for Linda, who clung to Scarpa's arm throughout. A seasoned traveler, Scarpa drank and ate heartily, even as the plane was buffeted by turbulence. Every so often he would pull Linda close and tell her not to worry, that they'd be on the ground soon and everything would be all right. They landed in Mobile, Alabama, and took a cab to their hotel, a magnificently preserved antebellum resort that reminded Linda of something out of Gone with the Wind. As they walked into the lobby, Linda and Greg Sr. noticed more than a dozen federal agents on the mezzanine above, carefully watching their every move. Scarpa told her not to worry. They were all on the same team. As Linda unpacked her bags in their luxurious suite, a man with close-cropped hair wearing a black suit came into the living room. Linda watched as he spoke briefly with Scarpa. Before leaving, the man nodded grimly and handed him a gun. Scarpa escorted the man to the door, then walked over to Linda. His face betrayed a hint of trepidation, something Linda rarely saw in Greg. "I'm going out with these men," he explained. "If I'm not back, there's a return ticket on the bureau." Scarpa reached into his pocket and withdrew a stack of bills. "Here, take this." Despite the tone of seriousness in Scarpa's voice, Linda was only mildly concerned. In her eyes, Greg Sr. was invincible. He had survived, even thrived, in the toughest milieu around, the Mafia world of New York City. What harm could possibly come to him here in the bucolic South? Surely these people were no match for a man like Greg Scarpa Sr. He was the most fearless person Linda had ever met, and she simply could not imagine any situation in which he would be unable to cope. After the agents briefed him, Greg Sr. drove a rented car to a small appliance store owned by a Klansman named Bird. Scarpa concocted a story to gain favor with Mr. Bird, telling the store owner that he had recently arrived from Chicago, would be working in town for some time, and that he wanted to buy a TV set. They haggled over the price, but finally came to terms. Scarpa then instructed the man to hold the set while he arranged for a place to live. He said he would be back before closing time that night to pick up the merchandise. As promised, Scarpa returned to the store shortly before 9 p.m. The place was empty, save for the proprietor. "Would you put the set in my car, please?" Scarpa asked Mr. Bird. "I have a bad back and can't lift anything." Mr. Bird obliged, carrying the set out to Scarpa's car. The manager opened the car's back door and pushed the set in. As Bird leaned in to secure the television, Scarpa shoved him hard to the floor and jumped onto the back seat. He stuck a pistol in the man's ribs and told him to lie still and keep his mouth shut. An FBI agent who had been hiding in the front seat suddenly sat up and began to drive the car. They drove south for several hours, a second car filled with federal agents tailing them every inch of the way. When they arrived at the appointed safe house, a lonely country cabin tucked deep in the Mississippi woods, the agents took up positions around the house to guard against any unexpected interruption. With the barrel of a gun pressed against his back, Mr. Byrd was led into the house. Scarpa directed him to a small room that passed for a kitchen and then bound the man's legs and arms to a chair. Then, as FBI agents stood outside, listening through open windows, Scarpa began to administer a brutal beating. Between blows, Scarpa would interrogate the man, asking pointed questions about the 3 missing civil rights workers. What had happened to them? Who killed them? Where were the bodies? Fearing for his life and wanting only for the beating to end, the man offered an account of the murder and burial. But the waiting agents responded with skepticism. "He's lying," they told Scarpa. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." At first, Scarpa kept his cool, even as the interrogation continued. But as hours passed and the FBI continued to dismiss Byrd's information as fraudulent, Scarpa grew frustrated and began savagely beating the man. He slammed a gun barrel into Byrd's mouth, pulled down the trembling Klansman's pants, put a razor blade against his penis, and made a few preliminary cuts. "Tell me the fucking truth or I'll blow your fucking brains out and cut off your dick," he said. Byrd, terrified and weeping, finally began to talk. He admitted that after Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price arrested the 3 civil rights workers 6 weeks earlier, he had sent out word that those arrested included a young man referred to as Goatee, the Klan's code name for Schwerner, who had been marked for death by the Klan's imperial wizard, Sam Bowers. Deputy Price had detained the civil rights workers long enough for Edgar Ray Killen, a preacher and local Klan leader, to round up a posse. As Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman headed down Route 19 that evening, Deputy Price tailed them in his cruiser, followed by 2 carloads of Klansmen, including Mr. Byrd himself. After a frantic chase, the 3 men were caught, taken to an isolated spot on Rock Cut Road, murdered in quick succession, and buried below an earthen dam on the farm of Olin Burridge, one of Philadelphia's wealthiest citizens. Their Ford wagon was set ablaze. Scarpa returned to his hotel early the next morning, just in time to leave for the airport. In the cab, Linda nestled close to Greg Sr. and asked if his mission had been successful. "Everything worked out just fine, sweetheart," he said. "We got the guy to talk no problem." Scarpa and Linda arrived in Miami that evening and checked into the Fontainebleau Hotel, where they stayed for 2 days before flying back to New York. The entire tab for the trip was picked up by the United States government. By the time they returned, the FBI had recovered the bodies of the 3 missing civil rights workers precisely at the spot where Byrd said they had been buried. The discovery of the bodies was front-page news all over the country, and the case received widespread media attention for months to come. Linda and Greg Sr. watched the reports with bemusement and maybe a trace of satisfaction. Not once was Scarpa linked to the case or the investigation. His involvement had been clandestine, his role that of hired muscle, professional interrogator. And he had executed the task to perfection. Near the end of the year, federal agents arrested 18 men for conspiring to deny Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman their civil rights. After numerous delays, a federal jury convicted 7 defendants, including Deputy Sheriff Price. 3 more went free when the jury deadlocked. The rest, including Bird, were acquitted. Bird told anyone who would listen about how he had been kidnapped by the FBI and beaten viciously by a nameless thug. His story was generally dismissed as unworthy or unbelievable. Although the state of Mississippi failed to charge the defendants with murder, and most are still free men, this incident in Philadelphia, Mississippi, changed the course of the civil rights movement and caused new laws to be enacted. For his brutal and unrepentant, although thoroughly professional, handiwork in Mississippi, Greg Scarpa Sr. was paid several $1,000s and given a virtual lifetime get-out-of-jail-free card. He continued to run his Mafia enterprises without fear of retribution or prosecution. In a very real sense, Scarpa had been given a license to kill. Chapter 9. Married to the Mob. Inevitably, perhaps, the relationship between Linda and Greg Scarpa evolved to a level of intimacy and comfort that was bound to cause problems. Against her better judgment, Linda had fallen deeply in love with Greg. And it wasn't just the money and power she found attractive. Linda knew a side of him unrecognizable to others. With her, he was sensitive, thoughtful, and generous. What Linda wanted, of course, was a more traditional, monogamous relationship. Like many a Gumar, she tired of the mistress's role, with its layers of secrecy and shame. What once was exciting now seemed tawdry, even humiliating. Eventually, Linda asked Greg Sr. to divorce his wife, Connie. Then, presumably, Linda and Greg would wed and live happily ever after. There are, however, no fairy tales in the Mafia. When it came to affairs of the heart and flesh, mob protocol was explicit and unforgiving. A made man could never divorce his wife, nor was he permitted to fool around with the wife of another made man. There were no exceptions, and one violated these rules under penalty of death. Scarpa proposed a compromise. He would separate from Connie and move into an apartment with Linda. Although unrecognized by the church or government, theirs would be a marriage nonetheless. Greg even agreed to start a family with Linda, something she had long desired. There was just one problem. Linda considered herself Catholic, personal moral transgressions notwithstanding, and wanted her children to be baptized in the church. So she devised her own rather twisted and unorthodox solution. She would marry someone else and have Greg Scarpa's children. The offspring would bear the surname of her husband and be baptized properly. Then, her babies having been blessed by the church, Linda would divorce her husband. She and the kids would live together under one roof with their stepfather and her one true love, Greg Scarpa Sr. To say that Scarpa disapproved of this plan would be an understatement. He recognized it as the impractical, overwrought, and potentially disastrous scheme that it was, and pleaded with Linda to accept his compromise. To some extent, of course, Scarpa was simply jealous of the idea that Linda would marry another man. In his world, what was acceptable for a male was not necessarily acceptable for a female. Linda, though, was not to be dissuaded, so she went off in search of a husband, if not necessarily a mate. In short order, Linda ensnared and released a series of potential suitors. A chiropractor who had been treating her father, Linda seduced him on the floor of his office while her father was in the next room, strapped into some sort of therapeutic device. Joey, a former boyfriend from the neighborhood who still carried a torch for Linda and was helpless at resisting her charms, and a handsome, diligent young man named Charlie Shiro, who worked full-time as an insurance agent and moonlighted as a waiter at a pancake house. Of this trio, two were quickly frightened away by the exploits and efforts of Greg Scarpa, who wasted no time in flexing his muscle in defense of what he perceived to be his own territory. The former boyfriend was a quick and understandable casualty, as he had the misfortune of working in the crew of a rival wise guy. When Joe Colombo got wind of Linda's intention to wed him, he quickly called Scarpa and reminded him of the rules. If Linda were to marry Joey, her relationship with Greg Sr. would have to end. Not surprisingly, Scarpa made sure that the wedding plans were aborted. Charlie Shiro was a more persistent and safer paramour, and ultimately his resilience paid off. On March 25, 1968, Linda and Charlie were married at City Hall in New York and flew to Miami for a honeymoon. The phone rang almost as soon as they set their bags on the floor of the bridal suite. On the other end was an agitated Greg Scarpa, calling to tell Linda that he was on his way to Miami. The honeymoon, he said, was over.
No, don't do that, Linda said. Look, I'll come back early, I promise.
Without waiting for a response, she hurriedly hung up the phone. "Who was that?" asked Charlie.
Oh, that was just the hotel, Linda lied. They wanted to send up free champagne. I said we'll have it with dinner.
Later, Charlie, the poor, hapless, newlywed husband, became embroiled with the hotel maitre d' after demanding the free champagne they'd been promised. Charlie and Linda returned home earlier than originally planned and went directly to the apartment of Linda's sister, Marianne, where they had arranged to stay until they found their own place. As soon as Linda arrived, Marianne told her that Greg Sr. had called.
He wants to meet you, now, Marianne said.
So Linda fashioned an excuse, which love-struck Charlie swallowed without question or complaint, and ran off to see the man she loved, leaving her new husband behind. Linda and Greg spent the afternoon and evening at a Brooklyn hotel, making love and talking, and trying to figure out how to make the best of their strange situation. It was Greg's contention that Linda had made a terrible mistake, and that the most sensible way to rectify that mistake was to leave Charlie Shiro immediately. They'd been married only a few days. It was still possible to have the union annulled. Linda rejected that proposal out of hand. Why should she leave Charlie if Greg wouldn't leave Connie?
"But I will leave Connie," Scarpa promised. "I just can't divorce her."
Not good enough, Linda said. Either she would have Greg all to herself, legally and romantically, or she would remain tied to Charlie Shiro. She would take his name while bearing the children of Greg Scarpa, just as she had planned. Charlie and Linda rented a small apartment on Brooklyn's Ocean Avenue, and they built a life that at least gave the presentation of some degree of normalcy. Dutiful and diligent, Charlie would rise early, make coffee, give his new bride a kiss goodbye, and head off for a long day of work. Linda would wish him well and promise to have dinner ready when he returned. Sometimes only a few minutes would pass before Greg Scarpa pulled up in his car and entered the apartment. He and Linda would have sex and then go out for breakfast. Often they would spend the entire day together. Before long, the days melted into the nights, and soon they were practically living together just as they had before Linda met Charlie. There were trips to nightclubs and to the racetrack with Linda's father in tow. Scarpa, not surprisingly, often benefited from insider information. It would be naive to suggest they were merely tips, and routinely dropped thousands of dollars on a single race. Sometimes he went to the window alone, quietly placing his bets. If the information was solid, however, he'd nudge Linda's father to tag along. Regardless, the booty was always shared. Sometimes Greg Sr. and Linda would take a room at the Golden Gate Motel, a gangster hangout on the Belt Parkway, or at one of the hot sheet motels on Staten Island. The active pursuit of pregnancy was a linchpin of their relationship, so sex, recreational or dutiful, was practically a part of their daily routine. Odd as it may seem, Charlie Shiro never questioned this arrangement and never complained about his very public status as a cuckold. Whether he was utterly clueless about the nature of his wife's relationship with Scarpa, this seems doubtful, or simply too frightened and lonely to face the truth of her infidelity, a more reasonable assessment, is impossible to say. Only this much is certain. The bizarre triangle endured for a few years and eventually produced the child Linda always wanted. Gregory remembers his astonishment the day that Linda came by for lunch with Greg Sr., and Gregory noticed the unmistakable belly bump beneath Linda's shirt. "I wondered if the baby was my dad's or whether it was the guy Linda married," Gregory recalls. "She told Charlie that my dad was an old, long-time friend of the family. I found this to be very mean to do to Charlie. I put myself in his shoes, and it didn't feel good. But again, this was my dad. Who was I to say anything? Maybe if my dad would have been a regular working guy, I could have said how I felt. But the kind of guy Dad was, well, nobody, including me, could or would say anything." Gregory's escape from the madness of his Brooklyn environment came at the end of the working day when he'd drive out to Staten Island to hang out with his little brother and to spend time with Diane. Weekends were even better. On Sundays, the whole family would hang out at our house, and we would watch sports on TV and eat my mom's meatballs and spaghetti, Gregory remembers. Then Dad would get a call from Nino telling him that he had to meet him in Brooklyn. That gave Dad an excuse to leave and go meet Linda. Whatever hostility Connie might have felt toward her philandering husband, she kept it largely to herself. Whether she still cared deeply for Greg Sr., no one could say for sure. Although it was hard to imagine anyone sustaining such an unrequited love, more likely Connie had simply grown accustomed to a certain degree of comfort in her life, and she wasn't about to threaten that lifestyle with a display of moral indignation. Connie carried herself with an air of sophistication and means. Her closet was filled with beautiful clothes and furs and the finest designer shoes. A generous weekly stipend ensured that she would never be relegated to window shopping. And, of course, she had her family. 4 children she adored and who in turn loved her. Was Connie going to risk forfeiting all of that over her husband's Gumar? Not likely. Scarpa seemed in some sense to be keenly aware of the selfishness that governed his own lifestyle, and to make amends, both moral and practical, he bestowed upon his family all manner of riches. Courtesy of his illegal ventures, he moved Connie to a sprawling horse farm in Lakewood, New Jersey, which was, coincidentally, far enough away from Brooklyn for Scarpa to use the distance as a good excuse for not taking the drive home most nights. By this time, Debbie had acquired a husband and home of her own, and Gregory was preparing to marry Diane. So Connie moved to Lakewood with her 2 youngest sons, Buddy and Frankie. To keep them happy, Scarpa stocked the ranch with 5 robust new horses and hired a friend to help the boys learn the basics of training and grooming. The complications escalated with the birth of Linda's daughter. Her name, too, was Linda. They called her Little Linda to differentiate between mother and daughter. And while her surname was Shiro, there was no question as to the child's paternity. Greg Scarpa Sr. was the father. Shortly after the baby's birth, Scarpa provided the means for Linda to buy a new house for her burgeoning family. He gave her a large cash gift rather than purchase the house himself, in order to avoid further raising Charlie's ire or suspicion. When Linda explained that the money had been a gift from her father, Charlie cast aside skepticism,
where did the old man get that much money, and eagerly embraced the job of house hunting. The newlyweds picked out a modest one-family detached house in Bensonhurst, and Greg Sr. continued his practice of stopping by nearly every day after Charlie had left for work. The little house became a base of operations for Greg. He'd make phone calls from the kitchen and sometimes even host meetings with Anthony Villano. For the longest time, all of this flew under the unreliable radar of Charlie Shiro. Eventually, though, even the nicest of guys grow suspicious. Or perhaps in Charlie's case, he'd simply grown tired of playing the fool. Charlie hired a private investigator to determine his wife's loyalty, or lack thereof. The stakeout, of course, required little effort and quickly yielded unpleasant results. Coming home from another late-night encounter with Scarpa, Linda found her father at her home and Charlie in an unusually foul mood. Linda's father, of course, had been keenly aware of Linda's second life and had benefited from the arrangement. His presence in the house now, after being summoned by Charlie, was merely to serve as peacemaker in what was sure to be an ugly and heated confrontation. Before Charlie could say anything, Linda's father approached her and whispered in her ear, "He knows." In a startling and uncharacteristic outburst, Charlie began screaming at Linda, calling her names and threatening her. Linda stormed out of the house, though her exit stemmed less from any fear that Charlie might actually hurt her than from concern over her unborn child. She was pregnant again, and again Scarpa was the father, and wasn't about to risk a miscarriage by becoming involved in a heated emotional dispute. Practically speaking, Linda had little cause for concern. Charlie was not about to kick her out of the house, especially since it belonged to her. Also, Charlie was no match for Linda, let alone Scarpa, when it came to acting on impulse. He was a cautious, measured man. Given time, he would come to understand, if not appreciate, Linda's situation. And the more he learned about his wife's lover, the less he wanted to engage in any sort of dispute, whether over the custody of little Linda, ownership of their home, the parameters of their marriage, or anything else. He would quietly accept the indignity of being married to Greg Scarpa's mistress, or he would suffer the consequences, most likely at the hands of Scarpa himself. Only after the birth of their second child, a baby boy named Joey, did Linda begin to seriously question the durability of her current arrangement. It happened one day while all three adults were in the house and a nurse was taking care of Joey. As the nurse changed the baby's diaper and cleaned and caressed him, she let out a little chuckle. "You know, Mr. Gregg, this baby has your ears and your eyes," the nurse said, not quite understanding the wound she had opened. Charlie sat mute. Scarpa, however, started laughing. Linda, meanwhile, tried to change the subject, but she knew in that moment that it was time to end the charade. It was time to end her marriage to Charlie and to begin her real life with the man she loved. Chapter 10. Murder, Inc. Joseph Joe Brewster DiDomenico was, in Mafia parlance, a stand-up guy. Quick with a joke, a reliable and loyal friend, and a remarkably skilled and efficient killer, Joe Brewster was among the most valued and popular members of Greg Scarpa's crew. Their friendship reached deep into the past and transcended the usual boundaries of business. Of course, not even Joe Brewster knew of Scarpa's secret life. He trusted and admired Greg Sr., and over the years had become one of the top earners in the crew, an energetic and inventive worker who could always be counted on to generate new schemes and crimes. One of Joe Brewster's buddies, for example,
had devised a pick that was remarkably efficient at popping the locks of payphones. Scarpa thought it was an ingenious little gadget and loved putting it into practice. Sometimes he would go several miles out of his way just for the thrill of stealing $50 in dimes. He used the pick at hospitals, airports, restaurants. Once he even cracked the box of a courthouse phone. For months, Scarpa and some of the crew, with Linda in tow, drove up and down the eastern seaboard, Boston, Baltimore, New York, New Jersey, picking locks and disgorging payphones. They would stay overnight at a nice hotel, relax, go swimming, take a sauna, have an expensive dinner, get a good night's sleep, and repeat the routine the next day. On one of their excursions, Linda and the boys stopped for the night at a Baltimore motel. Scarpa, as he did on occasion, reminded everyone of the importance of maintaining a low profile. Fueled by too much whiskey, however, Sonny Squint became rambunctious and argumentative. Unhappy with the service at a rooftop bar, he tossed a waiter holding a tray of drinks off the roof and into a pool. Scarpa immediately left the scene and returned to his room, where he summoned Sonny Squint and chewed him out. Poor, drunken Sonny apologized profusely, broke down in tears, and then slunk away for the night. Alone with Linda, Greg Sr. exploded with laughter, recalling the strange and wondrous sight of the waiter still holding his tray, plummeting from the roof to the pool, screaming all the way down. A few days later, authorities caught up with the crew in New Jersey. Scarpa, Joe Brewster, and Sonny Squint were arrested. As usual, their time behind bars was laughably brief. All three men walked out of the police station within a matter of hours, and charges were soon dropped. The payphone scam ended rather predictably and suddenly, with the phone company installing new and more rigorous lock boxes on its equipment. A more traditional venture, stealing cars, followed the phone scam. The versatile crew proved adept at this as well, and soon everyone was driving late-model mob-mobiles, Cadillacs, Lincolns, and the like. For his trouble and tolerance, and probably to ensure his silence, even Charlie Shiro got a new car. As fate would have it, poor Charlie, ever laboring under a dark cloud, was soon pinched by the cops and charged with auto theft. What could he do but reach out to his former nemesis? Scarpa took the call from Shiro while hanging out at Wimpy Boys. He drove straight to the precinct house and, within an hour, after speaking with detectives, walked out with Charlie. All charges were subsequently dropped. Charlie was innocent, and, ironically, he even got to keep the car. Owing in large part to his chummy relationship with the feds, Scarpa naturally came to think of his crew as invincible. Predictably, the heists grew bigger, and the accompanying risks greater. Through Joe Brewster, he heard about a place in Manhattan's Diamond District that seemed ripe for the picking. The store's jewelry stands, adorned during daylight hours with diamonds and gold, were stripped each evening, and the gems were stored in safety deposit boxes in a locked rear room. Joe Brewster had recruited a safecracker familiar with the store's locks, so the heist seemed simple, at least on the surface. But there was one significant drawback. Actually, there were two drawbacks. The massive windows at the front of the store, which offered an eyeful to anyone passing by, and its proximity to a police station, which was located almost directly across the street. Undeterred by these obstacles, Scarpa devised a plan. The crew would utilize a large shade adorned with an image of the store's interior. A casual glance would tell passers-by that all was normal inside. Behind the shade, however, the crew would be hard at work, unlocking the safety deposit boxes and stealing the gems. For this particular heist, Scarpa recruited his son, despite a comparative lack of experience when it came to burglary. My dad told me that I would be going, but I'd be outside using the corner pay telephone to watch for any problems and wait for the guys to bring out the jewels," Gregory Scarpa explains. "He told me not to worry about anything because Nino would be in the vicinity for my protection. And he was. Approximately 1 hour into the burglary, I heard Nino honk his car's horn to let me know he was there." The heist was an unqualified success. Each member of the crew received $165,000 after the goods were fenced successfully. A similar fee was paid to the Colombo family, which always got its cut. And then, of course, there was the payoff to the FBI. "My dad took $10,000 from each of us for Nino," Gregory recalls. "I knew where it was going, but the other guys figured it was going to a guy named Charlie Moose Panarella, who at that time was my dad's captain. Nobody ever questioned my dad." As Gregory would soon realize, not only did Nino Villano receive kickbacks for serving as a lookout, he also aided Scarpa in ways far more nefarious and immoral. Indeed, according to Gregory, Villano provided information that enabled his father to execute certain mobsters. Moreover, Villano tacitly agreed with the killings. There was the time, for example, that Gregory asked Joe Brewster about a crew member named Jamesy, nicknamed Mutt. The guy usually hung around with Joe, but Gregory hadn't seen him in a few weeks and wondered what had become of him. Joe Brewster casually told Gregory that his father had ordered Jamesy's execution. Joe Brewster had completed the deed. By way of explanation, not that one was necessary, Scarpa had said that Jamesy was about to give the FBI information related to Scarpa and the crew. There was no choice, Joe Brewster was told. Jamesy was a rat and had to be exterminated. The source who revealed that Jamesy was about to inform on Scarpa? Greg's buddy, FBI agent Anthony Nino Villano. Something about this particular murder bothered Gregory, and so he asked his father about it. The response? "You worry too much, kid. Just try to have fun." In truth, Greg Scarpa Sr. wanted much more than that for his son. He had been preparing Gregory for a Mafia life almost from the day Gregory was born. Scarpa's logic was shameless but irrefutable. With Gregory in the family, as well as the family, Greg Sr. would have someone in whom he could place all of his trust, someone who would never betray him. To fulfill his or his father's destiny, Gregory was compelled to take another man's life. Murder was the cornerstone on which the Mafia Foundation was built, the mob's way of dealing with difficult problems. In order to become a made man, Gregory would first have to accept a murder contract and then successfully complete the terms of the agreement. The order typically came from the family boss or the capo. A wise guy could not decline a contract simply because he had some personal relationship or connection with the target. Indeed, it wasn't at all unusual for a murder to be carried out by someone close to the victim, as with Jamesy and Joe Brewster. A wise guy pledged allegiance to the mob and vowed to exact retribution against anyone who crossed the family. No discussions or debate allowed. Once completed, the murder would clear the path for membership. The newly made man, in a secret and solemn ceremony, would be inducted into the family. Greg Scarpa Sr. arranged his son's first hit. The target was a local restaurant owner who had run afoul of the mob. Early in the evening of the planned murder, Greg Sr. and Linda were dining at the cafe, having a good time, seemingly oblivious to the impending violence. In reality, Scarpa was trying to monitor the owner's routine in order to tip off his son. Eventually, Scarpa paid the bill and left the restaurant with Linda. Shortly thereafter, Gregory walked through the front door, numb with fear, but prepared to do his duty. He pulled a revolver from his jacket and steeled himself. But he couldn't do it. Upon seeing the owner, Gregory froze. He'd known this man for years, was friendly with his wife and children. Gregory had been dining at this restaurant almost his entire life, and when he thought about his family that would be left behind, he was overcome with sadness. Gregory tucked the gun into his coat pocket, turned, and walked out the door. After driving around the neighborhood for the better part of a half hour, Gregory found a phone booth and called his father. He fully expected Greg Sr. to be furious. This failure of nerve, after all, reflected poorly on Scarpa and his crew, and on the entire Colombo family. To his surprise, though, Greg Sr. expressed no anger, in part because he'd already heard about his son's inability to pull the trigger. He'd assigned a few guys to watch the restaurant while Gregory was inside. To Gregory's surprise and relief, Scarpa acted more like a father than a mobster. Sort of. "The first time is hard for a lot of guys," he said, "but I'm not worried about you, son. You'll be fine." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a chuckle. "You might even learn to enjoy it as much as I do." Chapter 11. The Goodfella Life. In 1971, at the age of 21, Gregory Scarpa Jr. married Diane Dimino. It was a large and lavish affair, underwritten by Greg Sr., who wanted only the best for his son. It should be noted, however, that Gregory paid for the $20,000 engagement ring that adorned Diane's left hand. Greg Sr. had urged Linda to attend the wedding, escorted by one of his friends, but she had politely and reasonably declined. Going to a wedding hosted by Scarpa's wife was not exactly Linda's idea of a good time. Still, it was a star-studded bash with scores of Mafia big shots drinking and eating and toasting, and stuffing great wads of cash into Gregory's pocket. Later, when he bought a house on Staten Island and had to explain to the Internal Revenue Service where he got the cash to pay for it, Gregory merely smiled. Wedding gifts. Joe Brewster, who had become one of Gregory's closest friends, served as best man. He and his girlfriend even joined Gregory and Diane on their honeymoon in Hawaii and Las Vegas. Everyone had a blast, and for a while, all seemed well in the Scarpa circle. But soon, the marriage began to fray, weakened by a combination of Gregory's late hours and Diane's youthful jealousy. "I opened a nightclub on Staten Island, and every weekend the joint would be full of guys and girls drinking and having fights," recalls Gregory. "Because of that, I felt it wasn't a place for Diane. When she was there, I would constantly have to watch out for her. I asked her not to come to the club on weekends, but she didn't want to have to stay home while I was at the club until 4:30 in the morning. Although I never cheated on her, she constantly accused me of seeing other women." Faithful or not, there is no denying that Gregory thoroughly enjoyed life as a gangster. It was, he discovered, a life of leisure. Indeed, one of the great obstacles for any career criminal who hopes to go straight is overcoming the pathological fear of the 9-to-5 world. "In my years on the street, from when I was 16 to 38, I never had to work a regular job," Gregory says with some satisfaction. "I went to sleep when I felt like it, and I woke up when I felt like it. It was a real good-time party life." Although the young newlyweds were at first thrilled to learn that Diane had become pregnant, the physical changes in his wife's appearance provoked an odd psychological response in Gregory. He began to feel uncomfortable making love to her because his child was so visible. Like most mafiosos, Gregory hoped that his firstborn child would be a male to carry on the family lineage. Imagine his surprise when the baby turned out to be a girl. Imagine, too, the way the disappointment lasted not even a moment as Gregory, standing by his wife's hospital bed, fell in love with the little girl they named Corey. Unfortunately, the expansion of his family did little to improve Gregory's relationship with Diane. 2 years later, despite Gregory's lack of enthusiasm, they had another baby girl, this one named after her mother. But the marriage by now was disintegrating in a cloud of jealousy and frustration. When Diane became angry, which was frequently, she threw things at Gregory. His response, typically, was to walk out of the house without saying a word and not return until the next day, if then. Eventually, they began sleeping in different bedrooms. Diane accused Gregory of having a girlfriend on the side, and she was right. By this time, in fact, Gregory was juggling 4 Gumars at once. What was good for the goose, though, was not good for the gander, not in the Mafia, and so it was that the marriage imploded upon Greg Jr.'s suspicion that Diane was cheating on him. When he told his father, Greg Sr. responded with a predictably mob-like display of paternal affection. He offered to whack the guy for Gregory. A nice gesture, Gregory thought, but perhaps a bit extreme. Instead, he settled for tossing Diane out of the house. My father told me to give Diane $10,000 and kick her out, Gregory recalls. I did what he said, but I soon felt so guilty that I began slipping her money every week without my dad knowing. He also paid for their divorce and made certain the girls were well taken care of. Diane's place was quickly taken by Lily, one of the 4 girls Gregory had been dating on the side. She was pretty and shy and seemed to understand her role in Gregory's life. At the time, Gregory was still merely a Colombo family associate in his father's crew. Greg Scarpa Sr. answered to Charlie Moose Panarella, who was, according to Gregory, a mean, strict, and very tough guy. Luckily, he took a liking to me and to Lily. Lily had class, and Goodfellas always admired and respected classy women. Charlie asked Gregory if he could hold his monthly mob meeting at Gregory's house. This meant that Charlie trusted Lily to serve coffee and pastries for the boys and to be respectful to them. Gregory, like the other associates in the crew, was expected to remain in the kitchen while Lily was in the living room with the maid men. In effect, then, she was privy to more inside information than Gregory himself. But such was Mafia protocol, and Gregory accepted it without complaint. Lily eventually gave birth to a baby boy they named Gregory III. The baby looked just like Gregory, who adored his new child and embraced the responsibilities of fatherhood with renewed vigor. But his life was complicated, and not merely because of the nature of his work. On weekends, when Gregory also had custody of his 2 daughters, the Scarpa home was a congested, tense place, and Lily grew to resent the division of her boyfriend's loyalties. She had a point, recalls Gregory. We would all sleep together in our bedroom. In the morning, the kids were up early, and they would start giggling and jumping on my back, which they knew I loved. As long as my babies were laughing and happy, that's all that mattered to me. As always, though, the ugliness of business interfered with any tranquility Gregory might have known. A beloved cousin and a member of the Scarpa crew, Gus Ferracci, in the process of screwing up a drug deal, killed a DEA agent. Such transgressions were not treated lightly. Federal law enforcement typically responded with overwhelming force when one of their members was killed in the line of duty. Ferracci would draw considerable attention and heat until he was brought to justice. In the meantime, any arrangements between the FBI and informants would likely be suspended or strained. In other words, Gus Ferracci had to go. To Greg Scarpa, this was no big deal. A bit of internal house cleaning was necessary on occasion to preserve the greater good, and so he gave the order authorizing the killing of one of his own crew members, who also happened to be his nephew. Greg's sister, Gus's mother, appears to have had no knowledge of Greg's involvement. Ferracci was gunned down, gangland style, shot 11 times in the face, chest, and neck. Gregory took the news hard. This, he thought, was a line that shouldn't have been crossed. Wasn't family the most important thing in the world? Greg Sr. shrugged, said he loved the kid too, but business is business. The son, at this point, had yet to acquire the father's hardness, his resolve to do whatever was necessary. He became haunted by nightmares, visited in the depths of the night by the memory of his cousin. "I was very upset," Gregory says. "I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Gus's face. I just didn't know how my dad could kill him. I loved him." To ease the pain and encourage the onset of sleep, Gregory began drinking heavily. Predictably, his relationship showed signs of strain. Lily found his drinking distasteful, particularly with a baby in the house. She also accused him of fooling around. Her suspicions, of course, were well-founded. If Gregory wanted to be faithful, he lacked the resolve and commitment, in part because the wise guy lifestyle hardly encouraged monogamy. Attractive, available women were always hanging around. Women who liked to drink and party. Women who had no use for commitment or love. Ultimately, Gregory and Lily separated. Gregory helped expand his father's burgeoning empire by opening another nightclub, this one called On the Rocks. Greg Sr. and Capo Anthony Scarpati were his partners. The lounge was a solid moneymaker, but turned out to be a bit of a headache, primarily because it was located within the territory of a Staten Island crew run by a mobster named Alfred Longobardi. Mafia turf wars were nasty and often bloody, and this one was no different. One night, as Gregory parked his car outside the club, he felt something cold against his temple. It was Longobardi holding a pistol. Gregory tried to remain calm. "Take it easy, Al," he said. "What do you want?" "For now," answered Longobardi, "any time one of my friends comes to this place, they don't pay for nothing." Gregory slowly nodded. "You got it, Al." "And my friend who lives upstairs from the bar," Al added, "he don't have to pay rent no more." "You got that too," Gregory said, speaking quietly, calmly. By cooperating and keeping his cool, Gregory was able to defuse the situation. Sufficiently appeased, Longobardi put away his gun, got into his car, and drove away. Gregory, of course, immediately reported the details of this encounter to Scappy, who became so enraged that he ordered the lounge closed and put a contract out on Longobardi's life for disrespecting Gregory. Nearly a full year passed before the contract was successfully executed. Al Longobardi died of a gunshot wound to the head at close range. Gregory was charged with the murder, but not convicted. He claims to this day that it was Greg Scarpa Sr. who pulled the trigger.